Some cages are built not to keep creatures in, but to keep the world from seeing what they've become. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, smeared with mud and bearing the wax seal of Blackmoor Castle, a raven clutching a dying rose. Elena Corvetti stared at the parchment through the grimy window of her London boarding house, where unpaid rent notices accumulated like autumn leaves. The position offered more money than she'd seen since losing her veterinary practice, since losing everything that mattered. Head maid to His Lordship Vladislav Dracul. The letter read, "Remote location, discretion required, no questions asked." She should have burned it, should have recognized the desperation in that final line. But grief makes fools of the wisest among us, and Elena had been running from her daughter's grave for 2 years now, seeking any darkness deep enough to swallow her shame. The castle loomed against storm-bruised skies when her carriage finally arrived, its Gothic spires piercing the clouds like accusing fingers. But it was the sound that stopped her heart. A wolf's howl, high and mournful, echoing from the tower windows with an ache so human it made her weep. What do you do when you discover the monster you're meant to serve may not be the most dangerous creature in the house? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Hook. Elena's tears had barely dried when the carriage door swung open with a groan that seemed to echo from the castle's very bones. The driver, a hunched man whose face remained shadowed beneath his hood, gestured toward her single traveling case with movements that spoke of long practice in silence. She gathered her skirts and stepped onto cobblestones slick with mountain mist, the wolf's cry still reverberating through her chest like a physical ache. The great doors of Blackmoor Castle stood twice her height, carved with intricate scenes of ravens feasting on battlefields. As Elena approached, they opened without sound, revealing a woman whose severe grey dress matched the storm clouds overhead. Her hair was pulled back so tightly it stretched the skin around her pale eyes, and when she spoke, her voice carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "Miss Corvetti, I presume. I am Mrs. Thorne, head of household staff. You are precisely on time." The woman's gaze swept Elena from head to toe, lingering on the worn fabric of her traveling dress and the scuffed leather of her boots. His lordship values punctuality above most virtues. "Follow me." Elena's footsteps echoed in the vast entrance hall, where portraits of long-dead nobles watched from gilt frames with eyes that seemed to track her movement. Candles flickered in iron sconces, casting dancing shadows that made the painted figures appear almost alive. The air tasted of old stone and something else, something metallic that reminded her uncomfortably of the surgical theatres where she'd once saved lives instead of running from death. "Your quarters are in the servants' wing," Mrs. Thorne continued, her heels clicking against marble floors worn smooth by centuries of passage. "You will rise at 4 each morning to begin preparations. His lordship keeps irregular hours, preferring the evening for his activities. The west wing is forbidden to all staff, as is the tower." She paused, glancing upward toward where that heartbreaking howl had originated. "You would do well to remember that curiosity killed more than cats in this house." They climbed a narrow stone staircase that twisted upward like a serpent's spine. Elena's legs, weakened by months of poor nutrition and sleepless nights, burned with the effort. At each landing, narrow windows offered glimpses of the landscape beyond, rolling hills shrouded in perpetual mist, ancient forests that seemed to press against the castle walls like hungry beasts seeking entry. The other servants, Elena ventured as they climbed, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. "How many?" "Speak only when spoken to." Mrs. Thorne's interruption was sharp as winter wind. His lordship values silence. The castle has known peace for decades under his rule. We do not disturb that peace with unnecessary chatter. They reached a corridor lined with identical wooden doors, each bearing a brass number worn nearly smooth by countless hands. Mrs. Thorne stopped at number 7 and produced a heavy key from the ring at her waist. The lock turned with reluctance, as if even the metal resisted entry to this place. Elena's room was smaller than the boarding house chamber she'd fled, containing only a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out over the castle's inner courtyard. The walls were bare stone, weeping moisture that had frozen into crystalline patterns. A woolen dress the color of ash lay folded on the bed, along with a white apron and cap that would mark her as property of this place. "Supper is at 6 in the servants' hall. You will meet the others then." Mrs. Thorne moved toward the door, then paused. "A word of advice, Miss Corvetti. Your letter of application mentioned you were recently widowed. Whatever grief brought you to our doorstep, leave it there. This castle has sorrows enough without importing more." Elena's throat tightened. She had claimed widowhood rather than explain the truth, that her daughter's death had shattered not just her heart, but her ability to heal anything at all, that the last life she'd failed to save had been the only one that mattered. After Mrs. Thorne's footsteps faded down the corridor, Elena sank onto the bed and stared at the servant's uniform. The fabric was good quality wool, better than anything she'd owned in months, but it felt like a shroud in her hands. Outside her window, shadows lengthened as afternoon surrendered to early evening. The mist rose from the grounds like spirits departing graves, and somewhere in the tower above, that wolf fell silent. The quiet was almost worse than the howling. Elena changed into the grey dress, her fingers fumbling with unfamiliar buttons as the cold bit through the thin wool. When she finally looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand, a stranger stared back, hollow-cheeked and hollow-eyed, wearing the uniform of servitude like penance. Perhaps that's what it was. Perhaps serving in this fortress of shadows would finally teach her how to live with the weight of all she'd failed to save. The wolf's howl began again just as the dinner bell rang, and Elena Corvetti descended into the belly of Blackmore Castle to meet her fellow prisoners. The ordinary world. The servants' hall lay deep in the castle's bowels, reached by a maze of corridors that seemed designed to confuse rather than guide. Elena followed the sound of muted voices and the scent of cabbage soup, her new boots echoing against stone floors worn smooth by generations of hurried footsteps. The wolf's cry faded behind her, but its anguish lingered in her bones like an old fracture predicting rain. She paused at the threshold of a low-ceilinged chamber, lit by oil lamps that cast more shadows than light. A dozen servants sat at rough wooden tables, their conversations dying as they noticed her arrival. Elena recognized the universal language of institutional dining, the careful hierarchy of seating, the way newer staff claimed spaces near the door while veterans commanded positions closest to the fire's meager warmth. "You must be the new head maid." A woman, perhaps Elena's own age, rose from a center table, her round face bearing the pallor of those who rarely saw sunlight. "I'm Mary Hensley, senior parlor maid. Been here nigh on 15 years. She gestured to an empty seat beside her. "Come before the soup goes cold. Though between you and me, it starts cold most nights." Elena settled onto the hard bench, accepting a chipped bowl filled with watery broth and stringy vegetables. Around her, conversation gradually resumed. Cautious talk of daily duties, complaints about drafty corridors, whispered speculation about their mysterious master's nocturnal habits. "Don't mind them staring," Mary murmured, breaking off a heel of dark bread. "New faces are rare here. Most who come don't stay long." She studied Elena's hollow cheeks and careful posture. "Though you've got the look of someone with nowhere else to go, those are the ones who last." A thin man across the table leaned forward, his eyes bright with curiosity that seemed at odds with Mrs. Thorne's warnings about unnecessary chatter. "Thomas Whitmore, groundskeeper," he introduced himself. "You worked in a house before. You've got gentle hands for scrubbing." Elena flexed her fingers beneath the table, remembering how those same hands had once performed surgery on animals half her size, how they'd trembled as she'd tried desperately to save her daughter from the fever that claimed her. "I've had various positions," she said carefully. "Mrs. Thorne says you're widowed," said a younger girl with prematurely grey streaks in her brown hair. "Lost my husband to consumption 2 winters past. That's what brought me here. Couldn't pay the rent after he died." She offered a wan smile. "At least here we've warm beds and steady meals, even if the work's hard and the master's peculiar." "Peculiar?" Thomas snorted softly. "That's charitable, Agnes. Man hasn't been seen by daylight in the 5 years I've tended these grounds. Sleeps all day like the dead, then roams the castle at night like some restless spirit. "Hush your tongue," Mary warned, glancing toward the kitchen door where Mrs. Thorne might appear at any moment. "You know she has ears everywhere." But Elena found herself leaning forward despite the danger. "The tower," she said quietly. "That wolf." The effect was immediate. Conversations ceased. Spoons paused halfway to mouths. Agnes crossed herself with trembling fingers, while Thomas's face went ashen. "Don't ask about that," Mary whispered urgently. "First rule of survival here. Pretend you don't hear it." Mrs. Thorne dismissed 3 girls last year just for speculating. "But it sounds so—" Elena searched for words that wouldn't reveal too much of her veterinary knowledge, her ability to distinguish between animal distress and something far worse. "It sounds almost human." "Aye," Thomas said grimly. "That's what makes it so terrible. Been going on for months now, ever since his lordship returned from his travels abroad. Brought something back with him, locked it in that tower, and now we all have to listen to its suffering." Agnes shuddered. "Cook says it's cursed. Says his lordship made a bargain with dark forces and that creature pays the price for whatever power he gained." "Cook says a lot of things," Mary replied, but her voice lacked conviction. "Point is, it's none of our concern. We clean, we cook, we serve, and we keep our heads down. That's how we survive in a place like this." Elena spooned the tasteless broth, thinking of the intelligence she'd glimpsed in those amber eyes, the way the creature had seemed to respond to her presence. In her former life, she'd dedicated herself to healing, to understanding the subtle communications of creatures that couldn't speak their pain. The instincts that had made her a gifted veterinarian now screamed that something unnatural was happening in that tower. After supper, she followed the others through evening routines, banking fires, checking locks, preparing for their master's nocturnal wanderings. Her room felt like a tomb when she finally returned, the wolf's cries echoing through stone walls thick enough to muffle artillery. Elena lay on her narrow bed, staring at ceiling stones that wept moisture like tears. Tomorrow would bring the same schedule, the same warnings, the same careful dance of survival that these servants had perfected. She should be grateful for steady work, warm shelter, escape from the memories that had driven her from her old life. But as that tortured howl rose again from the tower above, Elena Corvetti realized she'd traded one kind of sleepless night for another. The howl came again, closer this time, as if the creature had moved nearer to whatever window or opening allowed its voice to carry through the castle's stone arteries. Elena sat up in her narrow bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. In the 3 weeks since her arrival, she'd learned to anticipate the pattern. The first cry would pierce the pre-dawn darkness around 4 o'clock, followed by intermittent wails until sunrise painted the mountains pale gold. But tonight was different. Tonight, the sound held a new quality that made her veterinary instincts scream warnings she couldn't ignore. Elena pressed her ear to the cold stone wall, listening with the trained focus that had once helped her diagnose ailments in creatures that couldn't speak their symptoms. The howl came again, weaker now, threaded with a rasping quality that spoke of damaged vocal cords and something far worse, the wet, labored breathing of an animal in respiratory distress. She'd heard that sound before, in the final hours before she'd lost patience to pneumonia or internal bleeding. The creature in the tower was dying. Her bare feet touched the frigid floor before conscious thought could stop her. Elena pulled her woolen shawl around her shoulders and crept to her door, pressing her ear against the wood to listen for signs of Mrs. Thorne's midnight rounds. The corridor beyond lay silent save for the usual groans of settling stone and Thomas's distant snoring from the groundskeeper's quarters. The castle's layout had become familiar through weeks of dutiful service, the main stairs that led to the grand hall, the servants' passages that honeycombed walls, and the narrow spiral staircase she'd glimpsed behind a tapestry depicting ravens in flight. Mrs. Thorne had forbidden access to the tower, but Elena's desperate curiosity had mapped every possible route during her daily cleaning routines. She eased her door open and stepped into the corridor, her breath forming small clouds in the bitter air. Each footfall seemed to echo like thunder, but she forced herself forward, following memorized turns through passages lit only by the occasional guttering candle. The wolf's labored breathing grew louder as she climbed, accompanied now by a new sound that froze her blood, the soft whimpering of a creature that had given up hope. At the tower's base, a heavy oak door barred her path. Elena expected to find it locked, prepared to admit defeat and return to her room with nothing but guilt for company. Instead, the iron handle turned easily beneath her trembling fingers, as if someone had forgotten to secure it, or left it deliberately open. The staircase beyond spiraled upward into darkness so complete it seemed solid. Elena climbed blindly, one hand trailing along the damp stone wall for guidance, following the increasingly distressed sounds from above. Her heart hammered so loudly she feared it might wake the entire castle, but desperation drove her forward step by agonizing step. At the top, pale moonlight filtered through a partially open door, revealing a circular chamber that might once have served as a nobleman's study. Now it resembled a makeshift prison cell, furnished only with mouldy straw scattered across stone flags and a wooden water trough that had been overturned and empty for days. The wolf lay curled in the chamber's center, its dark fur matted with what looked like blood in the uncertain light. But as Elena stepped closer, she realized the creature was larger than she'd expected, nearly the size of a human child, and its breathing carried the distinctive rattle of fluid-filled lungs. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," she whispered, her veterinary training warring with the impossibility of what she was seeing. The wolf's amber eyes opened at the sound of her voice, fixing on her face with an intelligence so human it made her knees buckle. But it was what happened next that shattered Elena's carefully rebuilt world into fragments too sharp to ignore. The creature tried to lift its head toward her, and from its throat came not a howl but something far more terrible, a sound that might have been a word, might have been a name, spoken in the broken voice of something that remembered human speech. "Mama." The whisper was barely audible, distorted by vocal cords not meant for human language, but Elena's heart recognized it with the devastating certainty of a mother who had heard her own child's last words. She dropped to her knees beside the creature, her hands hovering over its fevered form as medical knowledge battled with supernatural impossibility. This was no ordinary wolf. The bone structure was wrong, the proportions subtly human beneath the lupine exterior. And those eyes, those heartbreaking amber eyes, held the desperate awareness of a trapped soul crying out for salvation. Elena faced a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could retreat to her room, pretend she'd never climbed those stairs, never heard that impossible word. She could survive in careful silence like Mary and Thomas and all the others who had learned to ignore atrocities in exchange for security. Or she could reach out to touch this suffering creature and accept whatever consequences followed from acknowledging the truth. That something monstrous was happening in Blackmoor Castle, and she might be the only one willing to fight it. The wolf's eyes fluttered closed, its breathing growing more labored with each passing second. Elena Corvetti reached out her hand. Her fingers stopped mere inches from the creature's fevered fur, trembling in the moonlit air, as if an invisible barrier held them back. The rational part of Elena's mind, the part that had been trained in anatomy and physiology, that understood the rigid boundaries between human and animal, screamed warnings that crashed against her heart like waves against stone. This is impossible. Wolves don't speak. Children don't transform into beasts. You're losing your mind, just like after Sophia died. The memory of her daughter's name sent a fresh wave of anguish through her chest. Sophia, who had whispered Mama in that same broken voice as fever consumed her small body. Sophia, whom Elena had failed to save despite all her medical knowledge, all her desperate prayers to a god who seemed to have turned his face away. Elena's hand jerked back as if the creature's fur might burn her. She pressed her palm against her mouth, stifling a sob that threatened to echo through the tower. What if this was merely her grief-addled mind conjuring phantoms? What if months of guilt and sleepless nights had finally driven her to complete madness? The wolf's breathing grew more labored, and Elena found herself studying its form with reluctant clinical precision. The proportions were wrong. She hadn't imagined that. The skull was too broad, the limbs too long, the ribcage expanded in ways that suggested anatomy caught between two forms. And those hands. Dear God, they were hands beneath the fur, with two long fingers that ended in claws but retained the delicate bone structure of a child. Mrs. Thorne's warnings echoed in her memory. Curiosity killed more than cats in this house. 3 servants dismissed last year for asking questions. Thomas's pale face when she'd mentioned the tower. Agnes crossing herself as if warding off demons. What happened to people who discovered the truth about Blackmoor Castle's darkest secret? Did they simply vanish into the mist-shrouded mountains, their disappearances explained away as abandoned positions or family emergencies? Elena thought of her own precarious situation. No references beyond forged letters. No family to search for her if she never returned to civilization. No one in the world who would even notice her absence. She could die here. The realization settled over her like ice water, shocking her back to the desperate reality of her situation. Whatever supernatural horror had created this creature, it served a master powerful enough to maintain absolute silence among his household staff. Vladislav Dracul commanded fear so complete that seasoned servants would rather ignore a child's suffering than risk asking questions. But if she walked away now, if she retreated to her narrow bed and pretended this moment had never happened, could she live with herself? Elena closed her eyes, remembering the weight of Sophia's fevered body in her arms, the way her daughter's breathing had grown shallow and desperate in those final hours. She'd tried everything: conventional medicine, experimental treatments, bargains with heaven and hell. Nothing had been enough. Nothing had saved the only person who'd ever called her Mama with such perfect trust. The creature stirred, its amber eyes opening to fix on her face with heartbreaking hope. When it tried to lift its head again, Elena saw the exhaustion there, the resignation of something that had cried for help until its voice was nearly gone. How long had it been trapped here? How many nights had it called out in this broken voice, while servants below pressed pillows over their ears and pretended not to hear? This could be her last chance to save something. Someone. But the cost. Elena's gaze darted to the open door, imagining Mrs. Thorne's measured footsteps on the spiral stairs, imagining those cold eyes discovering her here. Even if she could somehow heal this creature, what then? How did one escape a castle perched on mountain cliffs with something that was neither fully human nor fully wolf? How did one hide such a secret from a master who commanded supernatural loyalty? The logical choice was retreat. Survival meant silence, just as Mary had warned. Elena could return to her room, complete her contracted service, and eventually find another position in some distant city where the memory of tonight might fade like a fever dream. But as she watched the creature's labored breathing, as she saw intelligence and pain and desperate hope flickering in those 2 human eyes, Elena realized that some choices transcended logic. Some choices were made not in the mind but in the deepest chambers of the heart, where love and loss carved out spaces that could only be filled by acts of impossible courage. The creature's eyes began to flutter closed again, its breathing growing more erratic. In moments, it might slip beyond any help she could offer. Elena Corvetti took a shuddering breath, pushed aside a lifetime of careful self-preservation, and finally let her trembling fingers touch the fevered fur of something that should not exist. The moment her palm made contact, the creature's eyes snapped open, and Elena felt the world shift around her like a door swinging shut behind her, sealing her fate within these cursed walls forever. The instant Elena's palm touched the creature's fevered fur, electricity shot through her fingertips. Not painful, but startling in its intensity, as if she'd grasped a lightning rod during a storm. The wolf's amber eyes blazed with sudden awareness, and Elena felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known existed. The creature's breathing steadied slightly under her touch, and she realized with growing horror that the fevered skin beneath the matted fur was burning hot, dangerously so. Her veterinary training kicked in automatically, hands moving to check for swollen lymph nodes, assess the rapid pulse, examine the telltale signs of systemic infection that could kill within hours. But this was no ordinary examination. As her fingers traced the creature's throat, she felt the impossible architecture beneath, vocal cords that belonged to neither human nor wolf, but something caught between forms. The bone structure of the skull was wrong too, expanded and elongated as if two different skeletons were trying to occupy the same space. "What did they do to you?" she whispered, and the creature's eyes tracked to her face with desperate intelligence. It tried to speak again, lips and tongue struggling to form sounds around teeth meant for tearing flesh. "Hurt," came the broken whisper. "Always. Hurt." Elena's throat closed around a sob. Whatever magic had created this transformation, it was killing the child trapped inside. She could see it in the labored breathing, the fever that would soon cook vital organs, the way consciousness flickered in and out like a candle in wind. She had perhaps hours before it would be too late. "Listen to me," she said softly, her voice taking on the calm authority she'd once used with frightened animals. "I'm going to help you, but I need to know. Can you understand everything I'm saying?" The creature managed a slight nod, and Elena felt her heart break and mend simultaneously. Here was proof that some essential humanity survived beneath the lupine form, that this wasn't just a beast suffering, but a child, someone's child, trapped in a nightmare beyond imagination. "I'm Elena," she continued, stroking the fevered fur with gentle fingers. "I was a doctor once. I helped sick animals get better. I'm going to try to help you too, but it's going to be dangerous for both of us." The wolf's eyes brightened with something that might have been hope, and Elena knew there was no turning back now. The moment she'd touched this creature, she'd crossed an invisible line that separated the willfully ignorant from the damned. There would be no returning to her narrow bed, no pretending this was all a fever dream. She'd committed herself to whatever dark path lay ahead. "First, we need to get your fever down," she said, her mind racing through possibilities. The kitchen would have ice stored in the root cellars, herbs that might help with pain and inflammation. But reaching them would require navigating Mrs. Thorne's domain in the darkest hours of night, stealing supplies that would certainly be missed. And there were larger questions looming, questions that made her stomach clench with fear. Who had done this? Was it some experiment of Vladislav Dracul himself? Or had he inherited this cursed creature along with his ancient castle? More importantly, was this transformation permanent, or could it somehow be reversed? The wolf stirred in her arms, and Elena realized she'd unconsciously pulled it closer, cradling its too large form against her chest, the way she'd once held Sophia during her daughter's worst fever spells. The parallel was too painful to examine closely, but it explained the fierce protectiveness now burning in her heart. "Tell me your name," she whispered against the creature's ear. "Your real name." The amber eyes closed for a moment, as if the effort of remembering was almost too much. Then, in a voice barely audible, Lucian. Elena tested the name, feeling its weight. "That's a beautiful name. How old are you, Lucian?" The creature's brow furrowed in concentration. 17. The uncertainty in its voice suggested that time had become meaningless in this place of perpetual suffering. 17. Just a boy, then, barely more than a child, transformed into something monstrous and left to die slowly in this tower prison. Elena's grief crystallized into something harder and more dangerous. Rage. 17, she repeated softly. "Then you're old enough to understand what I'm about to tell you. The people who did this to you, they're going to try to stop me from helping you. They might hurt both of us if they discover what I'm doing. Are you willing to fight alongside me, even if it means risking everything?" Lucian's eyes opened, blazing with an intensity that made Elena's breath catch. When he spoke, his voice carried a strength that belied his weakened condition. Yes. That single word sealed their pact. Elena Corvetti, who had spent months running from her grief and guilt, had found something worth fighting for again. She would save this boy or die trying. The howling wind outside the tower seemed to mock her determination, but Elena squared her shoulders and began to plan their impossible rebellion against the darkness. But even as determination burned in Elena's chest, the magnitude of her task crashed over her like a cold wave. She had committed to saving a boy trapped in lupine form by dark magic, something that should have been impossible, yet lay fevered and trembling in her arms. The practical challenges alone seemed insurmountable. "I need to fetch medicine," she whispered to Lucian, whose amber eyes tracked her every movement with desperate hope. "Can you wait here quietly while I go to the kitchen?" His answer came as a barely perceptible nod, and Elena gently lowered his head back to the mouldy straw. Every instinct screamed against leaving him, but without willow bark for the fever and clean water to flush the infection from his system, he would be dead before dawn. Elena crept back down the spiral staircase, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain it would wake the entire castle. The servants' corridors lay shrouded in deeper darkness now, the few candles having guttered out while she was in the tower. She navigated by memory and touch, following the stone walls until she reached the familiar territory of the kitchen. The heavy door creaked as she pushed it open, and Elena froze, listening for any sign that the sound had carried. Only silence answered, broken by the distant rumble of Thomas's snoring from his quarters near the stable. She slipped inside and felt her way to the pantry, where Mrs. Thorne kept her collection of dried herbs. Elena's fingers identified chamomile, lavender, and finally the distinctive rough bark of willow that could reduce fever. She tucked the precious medicines into her apron pocket, then moved to the great stone sink where clean water waited in ceramic pitchers. Just as she lifted one, footsteps echoed in the corridor beyond. Mrs. Thorne. Elena's blood turned to ice as she recognized the measured pace of the head housekeeper, making her midnight rounds. She pressed herself against the pantry wall, scarcely daring to breathe as the footsteps approached the kitchen door. Through a crack in the wood, she glimpsed the wavering light of a candle. The footsteps paused directly outside. Elena clutched the water pitcher to her chest and prayed to any saint who might be listening that Mrs. Thorne would pass by without entering. An eternity seemed to stretch before the footsteps resumed their path down the corridor, fading into the distance. Elena waited until she could no longer hear them before emerging from her hiding place. But as she turned toward the door, another figure stepped from the shadows. Mary, the young kitchen maid, her face pale with fear. "Miss Elena," Mary's whisper barely disturbed the air. "What are you doing here?" Elena's mind raced through possible explanations, but Mary's expression held no accusation, only worry and something that might have been understanding. The girl had warned her about curiosity being dangerous in this house. Perhaps she knew more than her frightened demeanor suggested. "I heard something," Elena said carefully. "Something that sounded like suffering." Mary's eyes went wide, and she pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. "You went to the tower." It wasn't a question. Elena studied the girl's face in the dim light, seeing knowledge there, terrible knowledge that Mary had been carrying alone. "How long have you known?" Elena asked. "Since I was 10, Mary whispered. "My first week here. I heard the crying and went to look, just like you did. But Mrs. Thorne caught me on the stairs." She pushed back her sleeve, revealing a twisted scar across her wrist. "She said if I ever spoke of what I saw, the next cut would be across my throat." Elena felt her stomach clench. "What did you see, Mary?" The girl's voice broke as she answered. "A child. A little boy, but wrong. Changed. He begged me to help him, said his name was Lucian, but Mrs. Thorne said he was cursed, that anyone who tried to help him would be cursed too." Tears tracked down her pale cheeks. "I was so scared, Miss Elena. I've heard him crying every night for 4 years, and I've done nothing." 4 years. Lucian had been trapped in that tower for 4 years, aging from a 13-year-old child to a 17-year-old youth, while slowly dying from whatever dark magic held him. Elena's rage crystallized into something diamond-hard. "Well, we're going to do something now," she said firmly. "Both of us." Mary shook her head frantically. "Mrs. Thorne will kill us. Or worse. She'll tell the master, and he'll..." She shuddered, unable to finish the sentence. Mary. Elena gripped the girl's shoulders gently but firmly. That boy is dying. Tonight, if we don't help him, can you live with yourself knowing you had the chance to save him and chose fear instead? Mary's tears fell faster, but something shifted in her expression. A spark of the courage that had once driven her to climb those stairs as a 10-year-old child. What do you need me to do? Elena smiled grimly. She had found her first ally in this impossible rebellion against the darkness. Elena felt the weight of Mary's trust settle on her shoulders like a mantle of responsibility. The girl's willingness to risk everything for a boy she'd glimpsed only once 4 years ago spoke to a courage that Mrs. Thorne's cruelty had buried but not destroyed. First, we need to get medicine to Lucian, Elena whispered, her mind organizing the immediate tasks. His fever could kill him within hours. Then we need to find out more about his condition, how he was transformed, whether it can be reversed, and most importantly, who's responsible. Mary nodded, wiping her eyes with shaking hands. Mrs. Thorne keeps records in her office. Household accounts, staff assignments, correspondence with the master. If there's information about the boy, it would be there. Can you reach those records without being caught? I clean her office every morning before dawn. I know where she keeps the keys. Mary's voice grew stronger as purpose replaced fear. But Miss Elena, what if we discover things we'd rather not know? What if the master himself... Elena had wondered the same thing during her climb back down from the tower. Vladislav Dracul commanded absolute loyalty through fear, but was he the architect of Lucian's suffering, or merely its guardian? The distinction might determine whether they were attempting rescue or revolution. Whatever we discover, that boy needs immediate help, Elena said firmly. We'll face the larger implications once he's stable. They divided their tasks with the efficiency born of desperation. Mary would retrieve the records while Elena returned to the tower with medicine and clean water. They would meet in Elena's quarters before dawn to share what they'd learned and plan their next move. As Mary slipped away into the darkness, Elena gathered her supplies and began the treacherous journey back to the tower. Each step felt heavier than the last, weighted with the knowledge that she was no longer acting alone. Mary's involvement multiplied both their chances of success and the potential consequences of failure. The tower door stood ajar as she'd left it, but Elena's blood chilled when she heard voices echoing from above. She pressed herself against the stone wall, listening with growing horror as Mrs. Thorne's cultured tones drifted down the spiral staircase. Condition has deteriorated significantly. The fever suggests the binding is finally breaking down his constitution. A second voice responded, male, with an accent Elena couldn't place. The master will not be pleased. This specimen was intended to last another year at minimum. Elena's hands trembled around the water pitcher. They spoke of Lucian as if he were an experiment, a thing to be preserved for unknown purposes rather than a dying child who needed help. Perhaps it's time to consider replacement, Mrs. Thorne continued. The village below has children who wouldn't be missed. Orphans, street rats. The male voice made a sound of consideration. The transformation ritual grows more dangerous each time. We've lost 3 subjects in the past decade to the process itself. Better to extract what value we can from this one before he expires naturally. Elena bit her lip to stifle a gasp of horror. Extract what value? What could they possibly want from Lucian that required keeping him alive in this tortured state? Footsteps began descending the stairs. Elena retreated quickly, pressing herself into an alcove as the 2 figures emerged from the tower. Mrs. Thorne carried a lantern that cast dancing shadows on the walls, while her companion remained a dark silhouette, tall, thin, wearing what appeared to be formal evening dress despite the hour. Double the sedatives, the man instructed as they passed Elena's hiding place. We cannot afford to have him making noise if the new maid proves as curious as the last one. Of course, Dr. Constantine. Though I should mention, Miss Corvetti was asking questions about the tower sounds just yesterday. Elena's breath caught. They were discussing her, had already marked her as a potential threat. Then perhaps it's time for another staff reduction, Dr. Constantine replied smoothly. Arrange for Miss Corvetti to have an accident. Something believable. A fall down the stairs, perhaps, or a tragic encounter with wolves during a misguided midnight walk. The voices faded as they moved deeper into the castle, but Elena remained frozen in her alcove, the full weight of her situation crashing over her. Mrs. Thorne hadn't simply threatened Mary 4 years ago. She'd been protecting a conspiracy that involved medical experiments, murdered children, and a systematic process of disposing of anyone who discovered the truth. Elena was now marked for death, and Mary's life hung in the balance as well. But even as terror threatened to paralyze her, Elena thought of Lucien lying fevered and helpless in the tower above. Whatever Dr. Constantine planned to extract from the boy, it would happen soon. The window for rescue was closing rapidly. Elena gripped the medicine bottles in her apron and forced her trembling legs to carry her back up the spiral stairs. She would save Lucien tonight, or they would both die trying. There was no middle ground left. The approach had begun, and retreat was no longer an option. The tower felt colder when Elena returned, as if the presence of Mrs. Thorne and Dr. Constantine had leached all warmth from the stone walls. She found Lucien exactly where she'd left him, but his condition had visibly worsened in the brief time she'd been gone. His breathing came in shallow gasps, and when she pressed her palm to his fevered brow, the heat nearly burned her skin. "I'm here," she whispered, pulling the willow bark from her apron. "Hold on, Lucien." She worked quickly, crushing the bark between 2 stones and mixing it with water from the pitcher. The makeshift medicine was crude compared to what she'd once prepared in her veterinary practice, but it would have to suffice. As she lifted Lucien's massive head to help him drink, she fought against the images Mrs. Thorne's words had painted in her mind. Extract what value we can from this one. What could they possibly want from a dying boy that required keeping him trapped in this agonizing form? Elena's medical knowledge offered terrifying possibilities: blood, organs, bone marrow, even brain tissue harvested from a creature caught between human and animal forms. The applications for such materials in dark magical practices made her stomach revolt. Lucien managed to swallow the medicine, though his lupine throat struggled with the motion. Elena used the remaining water to clean the worst of his wounds, watching as infected flesh revealed itself beneath matted fur. Without proper surgical tools, she could only apply pressure to stem the bleeding and pray that the willow bark would buy them precious time. "They're going to hurt you," she told him quietly, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. "A doctor named Constantine. He's planning some kind of procedure. We have to get you out of here tonight." Lucien's amber eyes widened with fear, but also something else, a flicker of desperate hope. When he tried to speak, his voice came out as barely more than a growl. "Can't walk." Elena had suspected as much. Whatever dark magic bound him grew stronger as his human consciousness weakened, and the fever had sapped what little strength remained. Moving him would require help, but bringing others into the conspiracy meant signing more death warrants. The sound of footsteps on the stairs below made both of them freeze. Elena pressed herself against the stone wall, pulling Lucien's head into her lap to muffle any sound he might make. But instead of Mrs. Thorne's measured pace, she heard the lighter tread of someone trying to move quietly. "Miss Elena." Mary's voice drifted up from the stairwell, barely audible. "Are you there?" Elena's relief was so sharp it nearly brought tears to her eyes. "Here," she called softly. "But be careful. They were just here." Mary appeared moments later, her arms full of ledgers and loose papers. Her face went pale when she saw Lucien's deteriorated condition, but to her credit, she didn't flee or scream. Instead, she knelt beside them and began spreading documents across the moldy straw. "I found records," she whispered urgently. "Miss Elena, this is worse than we thought." Elena continued administering medicine while Mary shuffled through papers by the dim light filtering through the tower's single window. The girl's hands shook as she selected a leather-bound ledger. "This is a list of children," Mary said, her voice breaking. "Names, ages, dates of acquisition. Lucien Dracul is listed here. brought to the castle in 1893 at age 13. Dracul. Elena's blood turned to ice. He shares the master's name. More than that. Mary turned the page, revealing detailed notes in Mrs. Thorne's precise handwriting. According to this, Lucian is Vladislav Dracul's son. The medicine bottle slipped from Elena's numb fingers, shattering against the stone floor. The implications crashed over her like an avalanche. The Vampire King was not merely tolerating the torture of an innocent child, but had condemned his own son to this living hell. Lucian whimpered softly, and Elena realized he had understood every word. She looked down into his amber eyes and saw not just pain, but the deeper anguish of a child betrayed by the one person who should have protected him above all others. "Why?" Elena breathed, though she wasn't sure if she was asking Mary or Lucian or the uncaring darkness itself. Mary turned more pages, her face growing paler with each revelation. "There's a correspondence here with Dr. Constantine. Something about preserving the bloodline while containing its power. They're using him as a source, taking his blood regularly for some kind of ritual." Elena's veterinary training kicked in despite her horror. Regular blood loss would explain Lucian's weakness, the pallor beneath his fur, the way his body seemed to be consuming itself to survive. They weren't just torturing him. They were slowly draining the life from his veins. "We're leaving," Elena said with sudden, fierce determination. "All three of us. Tonight." Mary stared at her as if she'd announced plans to fly to the moon. "Miss Elena, that's impossible. Where would we go? How would we carry him? And if the master catches us, then we die," Elena said simply. "But at least we die fighting instead of cowering." She looked down at Lucian's fevered form, remembering another child who had slipped away while she stood helpless. Not again. Never again. The ordeal was about to begin, but this time Elena would not fail. Elena's hands moved with desperate efficiency, gathering the scattered papers while her mind raced through impossible logistics. 3 people escaping a fortress where 2 were already marked for death. It was madness, but madness born of necessity. "The Eastern Wall," she whispered to Mary. "There's a section where the stones have crumbled. If we can fashion a rope from bed sheets." Footsteps thundered up the spiral staircase, far heavier than Mrs. Thorne's measured pace. Elena's blood froze as she recognized the distinctive cadence of boots she'd heard crossing the great hall during her first night, the master's own footsteps, moving with predatory purpose. "Hide the papers," Elena hissed. But Mary's trembling fingers scattered documents across the moldy straw instead of gathering them. The damning evidence of their discovery lay exposed, just as Vladislav Dracul emerged into the tower chamber. The Vampire King filled the doorway like a gathering storm, his pale eyes taking in the scene with terrible comprehension. Elena pressed herself protectively over Lucian's fevered form, while Mary cowered against the far wall, both women caught in the act of rebellion with no possibility of denial. "How touching," Vladislav said, his voice carrying the cold precision of a blade drawn across stone. "The new maid develops maternal instincts toward my ward." Elena forced herself to meet his gaze, though every instinct screamed at her to look away from those ancient, pitiless eyes. "He's your son," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "How can you allow this?" Something flickered across the vampire's aristocratic features, too brief to interpret, gone before Elena could determine if it had been pain or merely annoyance. "Allow?" He stepped into the chamber, and the very air seemed to grow colder around him. "Miss Corvetti, you profoundly misunderstand the situation." Behind him, Mrs. Thorne appeared in the doorway, her face a mask of vindicated fury. "I told you she would be trouble, Master, just like the previous girl who grew too curious about tower sounds." Elena's heart lurched. "Previous girl?" "Miss Catherine," Mrs. Thorne said with satisfaction. "Such a tragic accident falling down those treacherous castle stairs, though I suppose falling isn't entirely accurate when one has been pushed." Mary's sob echoed off the stone walls, but Elena felt only a crystalline clarity settle over her, the same focus she'd experienced during the most critical veterinary surgeries when a single mistake meant death. They were past the point of negotiation or mercy. This would end in blood. The transformation was necessary, Vladislav continued, seemingly oblivious to his son's labored breathing. Lucian inherited certain, inconvenient traits from his mother's bloodline, traits that made him unsuitable for his intended role, but too valuable to simply eliminate. Elena's veterinary training helped her interpret the clinical detachment in his voice. She'd heard it from researchers who viewed test subjects as data points rather than living beings. "You're harvesting from him," she said, pieces clicking into place, using his mixed blood for some kind of ritual. "Very good," the vampire said with mock approval. His unique heritage, vampire father, human mother, produces blood that bridges both worlds, quite useful for maintaining certain magical bindings that keep this region stable. Lucian made a sound that might have been a whimper or an attempt at speech. Elena's hand found his massive head, fingers tangling in matted fur as she felt his body temperature climbing to dangerous levels. The fever was killing him, and his father discussed him like a resource to be managed. "The boy is dying," she said flatly. "Yes," Vladislav agreed without emotion. "Which is why Dr. Konstantin will be performing the final extraction tomorrow night. We'll harvest what remains before his condition deteriorates further." Final extraction. Elena understood with sickening clarity. They intended to drain Lucian completely, taking whatever blood remained before disposing of his corpse. The boy who had once been the vampire king's son would die as nothing more than a medical specimen. "I won't let you," Elena said, knowing even as she spoke that her defiance was meaningless. She had no weapons, no allies with power, no leverage except her own willingness to die protecting a child she'd known for mere hours. Vladislav smiled then, an expression devoid of warmth that revealed the predator beneath his aristocratic facade. "Miss Corvetti, you seem to believe you have a choice in the matter." Mrs. Thorne stepped forward, producing a length of rope from her apron. "Shall I bind them now, Master? Dr. Konstantin mentioned that fresh subjects would be useful for testing the new restraint methods." Elena's last hope crumbled as she realized the true scope of her failure. Not only had she failed to save Lucian, but her desperate attempt at rescue had condemned Mary to the same fate. The girl pressed herself against the tower wall, tears streaming down her face as she understood that their rebellion had only hastened their destruction. Lucian's amber eyes met Elena's one final time, and she saw forgiveness there. Forgiveness for a failure that wasn't truly hers, from a boy who had long ago stopped expecting salvation. The darkness had won, just as it always did in this cursed place.